My name is Charles K. Grant, and today's date is October 10, 2018. This interview is being conducted for the Legal History Project of the Nashville Bar Association. We're at Baker Donaldson's offices in downtown Nashville. Good morning, Matt.
Good morning.
What is your full name?
Matthew Joseph Sweeney III.
Tell us, what's your birth date and where were you born?
I was born in Sayre, Pennsylvania, and I was born on September 4, 1951.
Let's talk about your family. Did you know both sets of your grandparents?
My dad's parents were born in Ireland, and they met when they came to the United States as teenagers. I knew both of them. My grandfather died when I was a young teen, and my grandmother when I was in school, in law school. My mom's parents, her dad died when my mom was in high school, and my grandmother lived well into her late 80s. So I knew those grandparents well.
Where did you know them, in Pennsylvania?
No. My father had worked for Sears Roebuck, so shortly after I was born, we moved to Chicago, Illinois, and lived there until I was about 8 years old, and then he got transferred to New York. And so I primarily grew up outside of New York City, and my dad's parents lived in New York City, and my mom's mother lived in Jersey City.
Well, let's talk about your parents. What are their names?
Matthew and Dorothy. Matthew was an engineer and a colonel in the Army. My mom never graduated from high school, but she was the smartest person that I've ever known.
Where did your dad and mom grow up?
Mom grew up in Jersey City, and Dad grew up in New York City, primarily in Harlem.
What did he do, I guess, in Harlem?
In Harlem.
What did he do for a living, I guess, as a young man, when usually you think of someone around college age? Did he attend college?
Well, it's interesting because he grew up during the Depression. His father was a longshoreman and then a foreman on the docks in Lower Manhattan. When Dad was in school, he got a job on the docks as well and loaded cars onto ferries part-time while he was going to school. He graduated from college, and some few years after that, he got drafted into the Army just before World War II started.
What did he do during the war?
He was a combat engineer. He went in as a private, and he came out as a major 4 years later.
That's quite an ascension through the ranks.
Very much so. He eventually became, he stayed in the reserves after World War II, and he eventually became a colonel. So most of our friends knew my father as the colonel.
Was he actively involved in politics or community activities?
He was involved in local politics, particularly when we were in Illinois, serving on, local town boards and things like that. By the time we got to Illinois, there were 7 kids in the family, and there was not a lot of spare time.
I would imagine. What about your mom? Did she attend college?
Mom did not attend college. She worked during World War, she worked from the time that she graduated from high school in the late 30s until Dad returned from World War II. She was a long-distance telephone operator in New York City.
Tell us about your childhood. I think you mentioned that you were one of 7 children.
One of 7 kids. I'm the 3rd oldest. First boy. I had 5 sisters and a brother. Everybody but one is still alive, and we're kind of scattered across the country, literally border to border, coast to coast.
Tell us something about your childhood. Now, you grew up outside of New York.
Well, my earliest memories are from Illinois, and it was a small town, Wheaton, Illinois. And it was one of those towns that even as a little kid you could wander all over the place. And from all reports, I did. So there are reports that somehow at some time I wandered over to the local college, which was a Billy Graham center known as Wheaton College. And somehow I met the president of the college and introduced him to my mother. I have no idea how that happened.
How old were you?
Something less than 8 years old. So, but it was just, kind of the way things were back then. Things were very free, and you could wander around without people talking about whether your parents should be letting you wander around. Then we moved to to New Jersey from Illinois, and grew up in a suburb of New York City. My dad commuted in by train every day, and it was kind of an idyllic sort of local town, good schools, plenty to do.
What were your favorite activities, heading into your, junior high years? What did you enjoy doing?
Well, this isn't exactly enjoyed doing, but my biggest goal was I wanted to play football. And my parents would never sign the permission slip for me to play football, which I figured was actually because they was afraid that I'd get hurt and it would be too expensive. So instead, somehow I think my mom, came up with the idea of letting me ride horses. Now, both my parents are city kids. They didn't know a lot about horses and didn't know that horses were a lot more dangerous. I eventually got thrown a couple times and knocked unconscious riding horses. But eventually, after I lived through riding horses, I said one year for Christmas, the only thing I wanted for Christmas was to play football. So finally in I can't remember, it was sophomore or junior, I think it was junior. Junior year of high school, I got permission to play football, and I did. But I was never very good.
What position did you play?
I played both guard and defensive back, which of course doesn't go together. But
Did you, as you went through your high school years, did you work part-time? Did you have any experiences that stood out in your mind?
I always worked. Everybody in my family always worked. That was kind of part of the deal at home. So I think the first job that I can remember away from home working is when I was, 14 or 15 years old, and I worked at a camp, summer camp, shoveling manure in the stables. That's one of my most vivid memories of jobs. But I did a lot of retail jobs while we were going through school. And eventually I became a lifeguard and did that.
You went to college?
Went to Seton Hall. All 7 of us went to college. The only real way to go to college was to live at home and commute, which we all did. I tried to get into the Air Force Academy, which would give me a chance to go away. But when I was going through the testing down at McGuire Air Force Base, I had to go through this particular one on death perception, and I go through it, and the instructor says to me, well, boy, you're never going to fly. You have no depth perception. So I ended up, I think, being a 6th alternate for admission to the Air Force Academy, which obviously didn't get me in.
Well, tell us about college. Now, you attended college at Seton Hall. What year are we talking about here?
This is 1969 to 1973. Seton Hall is a local college. It was basically a first-generation college. If your parents hadn't gone to college, it was a good place for you to go. You had a real option there. You had a choice. You could get a degree or an education, but you didn't have to get both. I was fortunate I did get both. I had a very good education at Seton Hall, driven much by a mad priest who was a frustrated non-lawyer who took a group of us under his wing as a pre-legal advisor and forced us to take all these courses that we didn't know that we needed to take, like accounting and economics and extra English, and his courses on legal history, where I think I took, 6 different classes in legal history. It was a great education. I was well prepared by the time I came to law school.
What was this priest's name?
Father Driscoll,
What did you major in?
history, with a minor in Asian studies.
Why Asian studies?
When I was a sophomore in college, I had this great summer job. I was an international tour escort. And
An international tour
tour
escort.
escort. And
That just begs all kinds of questions.
and I traveled to 11 countries in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia in one summer, including twice to Japan. And as a result of my exposure to the East, which I knew absolutely nothing about before that, I decided that that was the area of kind of the future, and that I needed to know more about it, and so I ended up taking a minor in Asian Studies.
So, Father Driscoll, did you call him Father Driscoll or
Yes.
Professor Driscoll?
No, Father Driscoll.
Is Seton Hall a Jesuit college?
No, it's a local diocesan Catholic college.
So Father Driscoll, basically pointed you out and a few others and said, you know what, you may have a future in law, and sort of steered you that way. Is that your sense of it?
I don't think he found us. I think we found him, and then he steered us. He definitely steered us.
So by the time you graduated from Seton Hall in 1973, you had pretty much decided you were going to become a lawyer?
I knew that I wanted to be a lawyer sometime early in high school.
Really? Mm-hmm. Were there any lawyers in your family?
No lawyers in my family. I knew nothing but from TV, I think.
Not be a teacher, not be a doctor, not be a fireman or a
Not
plumber,
be
but a
an
lawyer.
engineer. Right. No, to be a lawyer. And
Why do you think you were drawn to it?
This is the 1960s. It was a time of great social turmoil and change. And it seemed to me the most potentially productive way to change the world.
Were you involved in any, scandalous activities while in college? Did you get yourself arrested for protesting, anything like that?
No, I guess the scandalous conduct came more in law school, but we can talk about that later.
We will talk about that later.
Yes, I did go to some of the protests when I was in college, but from first 2 years of college, I was also in ROTC, so there was kind of a divided sort of situation, loyalty. You have to remember the draft still existed at the time.
While in college, what are some of your favorite things to do that was not actually related to your studies?
Played a lot of intramural sports. Listened to a lot of music. Music had a very, very profound influence on me. I would say that it was other than newspapers, might have had one of the strongest kind of social mores, opinion sort of influence on me.
What type of music?
Rock, folk rock, protest.
Did you go from college straight into law school, or did you work in between? What happened there?
Straight to law school. After my experience in traveling in Asia, I decided that I wanted to go to law school in another part of the country, a different part than where I had lived before, so that kind of knocked out the Midwest and the East Coast. And so that left the West and the South, and I didn't know anything particular about the West. And I had a strong bias against the South, primarily from media. So I decided that it was an area of the country that I needed to know more about, or I should know more about. And so I decided to focus primarily on Southern law schools. And I had another professor, economics professor, who told me about Vanderbilt, where he had started in the law school and then decided he didn't want to be a lawyer. But he told me that I should look at Vanderbilt because it was a great school. And I had never heard of it before.
You had never heard of Vanderbilt University?
Nope. I was pretty provincial, probably still am. And I had never heard of it before, but I looked into it and I saw that they seemed to have an affirmative action program for students from New Jersey, because they seem to take 4 or 5 every year. So I applied and I got accepted.
Did you apply to any other law schools, or was it just Vanderbilt?
No, I applied to a bunch of other law schools. But I tell you the truth, I can't. The only one that I can remember that I applied to, because I was looking primarily at Southern schools, is William and Mary. I also applied to Georgetown, who I never heard from at all, anything.
Wow. So did you visit these places before or was it sight unseen?
Did not have the money to visit. So I got admitted. I contacted them. I asked them to provide me with the cheapest student housing that they had, which was assigning me to a 1-bedroom unit in Lewis House on campus with another roommate who turned out to be a guy from Long Island. And I figured, hey, that's great. You know, Long Island, New Jersey, we're both pretty much the same. You know, that would be really good. It was terrible.
Why was he terrible?
We're just totally different. It was just, it didn't work. I guess one of the compounding factors was that he had an electric blanket and slept with the window open in the winter, and that I didn't have an electric blanket.
And he slept with the window open. I would imagine that arrangement didn't last beyond the first semester.
That lasted for a year. I
Wow.
couldn't afford to make any change. I had paid for it, so.
Wow.
Live and learn.
So what do you think was the primary motivation for you to go to law school?
Change the world.
That's a pretty powerful motivation. How did you think you could change the world as a lawyer?
I had no idea. But it seemed to be one of those tools. I told our kids when they're growing up, though, that if they really want to change the world, that they should become accountants. Because if you can track the money and control the money, you can change anything.
That's a different view of it.
Yep.
Do you now wish you had become an accountant?
No.
You took the usual, I guess, 1L course work there at Vanderbilt Law School?
When I was at Vanderbilt, there was no choice of courses. There were no alternate tracks or anything. Everything was assigned to you in the first year.
This was in the fall of 1973?
It was in the fall of '73. I got there, I was scared to death because suddenly I'm here with all these people from Harvard and Yale and Virginia and Brown and Texas. And I thought that I had bitten off more than I could chew. I didn't know that I could compete with people from those schools. And And then I found out, as I said, I didn't know anything about lawyers or law schools, that, in most of the courses that you're just going to get one grade at the end of the semester based on one exam. And that was going to be your whole grade for the semester. And I think there was one course where maybe we had an exam at the end of that semester, but it was a course grade at the end of the second semester from a second exam. And I didn't like that at all. And then, so the only thing that you're going to get any periodic grades on were you were assigned to a writing advisor, and you had to do papers, and then they would get graded. And the first paper that I turned in, I think I got a D-. And I hadn't seen grades like that in a long, long time. And a woman who I had a crush on in the class, her paper got an A and was circulated to the group as the example of how you should write. I learned quick.
Did that D- sort of give you pause? Maybe, wow, maybe I shouldn't be doing this?
Well, it didn't give me pause that maybe I shouldn't be doing it, but it did scare me, furthering the fright that I had. And so I don't think I ever worked harder than that first year of law school, other than when I eventually took my first law job.
And we'll get to that. Who were your favorite professors and why?
Carl Warden, who taught criminal law and criminal procedure, because he was somebody very approachable and had a real interest in criminal law and criminal justice. And he was kind of a just interesting, quirky sort of guy. He believed in presenting courses in ways that you'd learn from them. So, like one time, a couple years before us, there was an event that he did where he had an event happen in the classroom that got totally out of control. But the reason for it was to see witness reactions to events. He was the type of person who would do things like that. And then Don Hall, who was also a criminal law professor, who was only, 6, 7 years older than we were. We had a number of young professors. And he was very much engaging of us, very open towards us as students. And he would also come to the Blackacre events at the end of the week with the students.
Blackacre being social activities?
Social activities with a keg out in Blackacre.
What were your favorite courses? We'll skip the 1L, the 1L year and talk about the 2L and 3L year when you had some choice over the curriculum.
Well, actually, it was probably one of the first year courses where I had no choice. It was constitutional law. I certainly did not always understand it, and now that I've been practicing so long, I have a better understanding of why I didn't understand it, because it didn't necessarily make sense or run consistently, just depending on when particular issues have been decided and by what courts. But yeah, I think constitutional law was probably my most interesting class.
When you weren't studying, what did you do during, what were your favorite activities in law school?
Well, since I lived at home when I went to college, I kind of made up for that.
How so?
I liked beer.
Okay. All right. So what did you think, how would you assess the value of the law school curriculum when you came out in 1976? What would you think? What did you think of the? Now that you look back on it, of the curriculum?
When I was in law school, one of the goals was to break the students down and rebuild them. And so you had to recite in class and you had to stand to recite. And it was very uncommon in that Socratic method to be directly and sharply challenged by the professor. And I don't think, I know that I didn't particularly like it, and I didn't necessarily appreciate its purpose, but I think it certainly made me more disciplined in my analytical skills and in my ability to present. Law school really doesn't teach you that much substantive law, or I didn't think that it did, but it taught you how to research the law and how to analyze the law. And from that standpoint, it was good, but it didn't teach you how to be a lawyer. So I had no idea how those people that you'd hear of who went straight out of law school and started practicing law did, because I certainly didn't have that capability. Also, what's important is that during law school, this was Watergate.
Right.
And so it was a time of very, very significant social upheaval and activism. And there was a lot of formal and informal discussion about law and the rule of law and the role of lawyers, because in Watergate, an awful lot of the people who committed crimes were lawyers. And that didn't seem to discourage them from getting involved in criminal activity. And so that was a matter of great discussion. There was a time when the president, being challenged, would make this statement, "I am not a crook." And when we took exams at Vanderbilt, you had to sign the honor code, that you hadn't cheated. And a lot of the blue books came with the imprinted honor code on it. If it didn't, you were allowed to just write honor code, just the word honor code, and sign it as the same expression of the honor code. Well, there came to be a time when the school actually accepted if you wrote, "I am not a crook," and signed it and submitted that in as your statement of compliance with the honor code.
You used to like to write poetry.
I did. Law school killed my ability to do that.
Seriously?
Yep. I lost that. For lack of better description, romantic ability to write, because everything became much more structured and rational, and for me, that just kind of killed that ability. Not that I had a lot of ability before, but it killed what I had.
So you graduated from Vanderbilt Law School.
Before I get there, there are a couple interesting things that I want to bring up about law school. My class was the first one that had a significant number of women. So about 20 or 25% of the class were women. And for some of the guys in the class, that was a real issue, which I didn't understand, having 5 sisters and a very strong mother. And I didn't understand any difference at all about guys going to school and girls going to school. I mean, it was the same thing for me. And there was one guy in our class that when he was drunk took a bet that half the women in our class wouldn't graduate with us, which obviously was wrong. And the only good thing about that was he ended up paying off his bets. I think that we lost only one woman in the class, to the best of my memory.
How large was your
several
class?
guys, about 160, something like that. But another interesting thing about women
So
in
you
the class.
lost one female classmate and several male classmates.
Yeah, yeah. One of the funniest incidents, though, in that regard about gender in the law school was there weren't enough convenient women's restrooms. And so sometime that first year, if my memory of timing is right, women just decided to take over one of the men's restrooms. But it wasn't freely surrendered. So it ended up as, I guess, one of the first gender-neutral restrooms in the country, because anybody could and did use it at the same time. But eventually, the administration learned, and it was converted to a women's restroom.
So tell me about this, this dashiki you wore. What's a dashiki?
I had a very good friend in college who was from Nigeria, Bayo Oshina, and he gave me as a parting gift when we both left Seton Hall a dashiki that he had brought from home. It was this beautiful patterned forested green and black dashiki that was embroidered with gold on the sleeves and gold on the neck, and I loved it. I thought it was beautiful, and I wore it sometimes in law school.
What'd your classmates think?
They thought it was a little strange. I guess I should say there were still people in law school that wore jackets and ties to class. So, I was the guy from Jersey with the dashiki.
Did you form any lifelong friendships out of that class of 1976?
It was a great class, and it was a close class. And what was interesting about it was that it was very much of a mix, a mashup. I talked about the number of women in the class. It was also about 10% African American. We had people who had just come back from Vietnam. We had people who came straight from the campus, and some who had protested, some who hadn't. You had much more of a national mix. There still weren't many people from the West, but there was a growing number of people from outside of the South. And so it was a real mixed class. I guess the person I became closest to was an attorney from Illinois who eventually went to practice up in St. Louis. We were roommates for the second and third year of law school.
Tell us something about your family now. You, at some point, married the amazing Judy Sweeney.
Yes, I married the amazing Judy Sweeney.
When did you meet Judy? Tell us about that.
I met Judy after I had graduated from law school. She had already graduated and gotten her master's from Vanderbilt in nursing. We were set up on a blind date. Both of us did everything that we could to avoid going out until our friends literally set the date of our first date and where we were going to go.
Seriously?
Yeah. So I ended up talking to her that morning that we were supposed to go out that night. I found out years later that it was a good thing that I called, because she said if I hadn't called, if I had just shown up, she wasn't going to be there, because she thought that was extraordinarily rude, that I would not have been in touch before. So we talked on the phone 2 hours that morning of our first contact before our first date that night. And then we married a year later, and we've got 3 kids and 7 grandkids.
And counting. Did you meet Judy right after law school, or had you started practicing law?
No, it was 2 years after I got out of law school. She was at that point part of the kidney transplant team at Vanderbilt. I can't remember whether she had started teaching at Vanderbilt at that point. I think she was an adjunct professor at Vanderbilt while she was on the kidney transplant team at that point.
You have 3 children. Any of them lawyers?
No. All of them made clear that they didn't want to be lawyers because they thought that I worked too hard.
Did you try to encourage any of them to be lawyers?
I neither encouraged nor discouraged them to be lawyers. I encouraged them to pursue whatever kind of career they wanted to that would support them in the lifestyle that they wanted to live in.
So following law school, where did you first start practicing law?
Started at Neal and Harwell.
And tell us how you came to be employed at Neal and Harwell.
I was interviewed 10 o'clock at night on a Friday.
I don't think we do it like that today.
By Aubrey Harwell and John Ross. And I had never met either of them before. I didn't know anything about either of them before. So I get there to the office and...
How did you know about the opportunity?
One of my professors in the law school, Professor Warden, was the one who had told them of me and me of them. And that's how I knew of it. And then I was told to call and arrange to come meet with them. And we had kept missing each other. And then I got a call this Friday evening, 9 or 9:30 at night, asking me if I would come down to interview. And
9 or 9:30 on a Friday night.
right. So I said, sure. I came down, so I get there, and here's this guy, Aubrey Harwell, and he's tall and he's impeccably dressed, and John Ross, who is still in a suit and tie at that hour. And I get brought back to Aubrey's office, and I have my resume, but I haven't given it to him yet. And he's strutting around the room, and he's hitting me with a battery of questions for a few minutes. I mean, it seemed like a long time. And then he kind of turned back to me, and he says, you're damn cocky. He said, but that's not necessarily bad. He said, if there's something behind that, you'll make a damn good lawyer. He said, if there's nothing behind that, I won't feel bad at all about cutting you down to size. and then he offered me a job, which I accepted.
Did you still want to work there?
Yeah, which I accepted. Great place to work.
What did they pay you?
In
I
meant to go back and look, and I know that it was either $13,500 or $14,500. I think it was probably $14,500. It was, at the top level of pay in town, and I considered myself very lucky. And that was the associate pay, which I actually, at that point when I was just hired as a clerk. So I didn't get hired as an associate until I graduated, a few months later. Because I guess this was, this is probably November or December of my last year. So I clerked, I worked throughout the remaining part of my third year, and then became an associate.
What did you think of that experience working there as a clerk during the school year?
Well, I missed more classes that semester than any other time that I went to school, ever. Because there was always a lot to do, and they needed help. So I worked really, really hard. It was interesting, it was challenging, it was fun. I enjoyed it immensely.
Let's talk about what your routine was as a lawyer. Obviously, you kind of eased into it a little bit, having worked there as a clerk. But when you became a lawyer, what was your routine like as a brand new lawyer?
I'd go in early. I'd work late. I'd either go out on a date or go home to go to bed. I'd come back early in the morning and start all over again.
What's early?
7:30. That's my memory. That might not be right. That's my memory.
And what's working late?
8, 9 o'clock at night. It was not unusual at all for those of us who were working, which was most everyone, to go out to dinner. There used to be a Shoney's downtown. That was a common place that we would go to. And have a quick dinner and then come back and work for a couple more hours.
How long, I guess with those kind of hours, it was probably, not much in the way of community activity or politics.
No. There was little time for anything.
How long did you work there?
I worked there for, I guess it's 2.5 years after graduation. I think that's right, something like that. Until, maybe it was a little bit longer. It was until sometime in 1979.
What was the nature of your practice?
The firm was well known for, and still well known for, white-collar criminal defense. And that was a lot of what I did in a very junior role. There were kind of two teams, basically. You're either part of Aubrey's team or you were part of Jim Neal's team. When I started, there were only 5 lawyers, and I worked primarily with Aubrey.
Any particular cases that stand out to you today?
Yes. There were 2 cases that Aubrey had me on that were these, what we called the blue jean cases. They were very peculiar mail fraud cases where Aubrey was representing one of the prime defendants in the case. And I was assisting in my junior role. But Aubrey was very good as far as giving responsibility and letting me do things, investigate marshal evidence and things like that. And these were 2 cases that went to trial for, I think there were 3 and 4 weeks. They could have both been 3 weeks with like a 3-week break between the 2 of them. Absolutely exhausting. Great cases, interesting personalities, terrific stories. It got me into court early on sophisticated matters where I could get a sense of how a trial really worked, how you put it together, how you presented it, what could happen. Because you have a 3 or 4 week trial, there's all sorts of things that happen, and some anticipated, some not anticipated, that you got to deal with. It was a very good way to kind of get the sense of how to be a trial lawyer.
What did you do after
Neal and Harwell?
leaving Neal and Harwell?
Well, when I was at Neal and Harwell, one of the cases that we had, non-criminal case that we had, was the defense of the warden growing out of the prison riot case. And corrections had always been a pet area of mine.
Corrections?
Corrections, prisons. And I had visited most of the prisons in New Jersey while I was in college. And I had gotten to know more about the Tennessee prisons from representing the warden in the riot case. So I had decided that the next governor who came in, regardless of who that was, that I was going to pass on my collected knowledge regarding prisons and issues that I had become aware of. And Lamar Alexander won the election, and Aubrey told me if I wanted to pass on information, I should get in touch with Fred Thompson, who after Watergate had come back to Nashville and was practicing here. And so I met with Fred a couple times and passed on information. He eventually asked me if I would agree to become the attorney for the Department of Correction to help reform it. This is after an era here that was known as the Blanton era, where there was allegations and convictions of people taking bribes to get prisoners out. And I said that I would agree to become the attorney for the Department of Correction for 2 years to help restructure it.
You're still a very young lawyer.
Oh, I was a kid. I mean, at that point I was, I don't know, 27, 28 years old.
That's pretty awesome responsibility for such a young lawyer.
It was really, really interesting.
So you went over there and worked for the governor as lawyer for the Department of Corrections for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. What are the major reforms that you were involved with?
Well, we had a situation of gross overcrowding in the prisons, and we had to reduce the population, which put us in conflict with the comptroller's office, who said we didn't have any authority to do that. So I had to work with the governor's office and the attorney general's office to confirm that we had the authority to contract and move people out. And I remember one particular time where it got contentious with the comptroller's office, and I was so frustrated and so angry that I told whoever that was from the comptroller's office that if anybody died because of their ridiculous and unwarranted delay in approving what we were going to do, that the blood of them would be on his hands. It had no effect.
Were you involved in politics at all to be
No.
locally or
No, not at that stage, no. Mm-mm.
So after a couple of years over there, what did you go back into private practice? What did you do?
I did. While I was at the Department of Correction, I met Lou Conner, who, again, I had never heard of before. But there was a situation over at the Department of Correction where there were some officers who were charged with assaulting inmates, and there was no way to defend them under the legal statutory structures in the state by either the Attorney General's office or through the Defense Counsel Commission. So the governor asked Lou Conner, his former partner, if he would defend them, and Lou said yes. And Lou and I met as I was kind of introducing him to the prison system and how things were and how things worked and all like that. So when I was ready to leave, I called Lou, who was still at D&E but just about ready to leave to go on the bench as on the Court of Appeals. And he told me that I should not do anything until I hear from him, that he thought that D&E would be interested in interviewing me. So I gave him my resume, I gave him a letter, and a couple days later I got a letter back from D&E that said basically they weren't interested in people like me.
D&E being Dearborn and Ewing.
Dearborn and Ewing. Dearborn and Ewing. So that was my second rejection from Dearborn and Ewing. I had been rejected when I was in law school as well. I had been interviewed by Lamar Alexander, but he hadn't invited me downtown. So a few months later, I was about to accept another job. I called Lou as a courtesy just to let him know that I was going to do that. And he told me not to do anything yet. And then I got a call from one of the partners at Dearborn and Ewing, and I was invited for an interview, and I was hired. And so then I practiced over there for about 6 years.
What was the nature of your practice over there? So this is roughly what?
This is 80 through 86, roughly.
And what was the nature of practice at Dearborn and Ewing?
Business and commercial litigation primarily. I worked with a partner by the name of Martin Simmons, who was primarily a business transactional lawyer, but he was involved in litigation too. And I learned business law and business transactions from Martin, and that's how I ended up working my way into business litigation.
Are any memorable cases that come to mind from your time at D&E?
There were several. I guess the one that's comes strongest to mind is we represented John J. Hooker in the fight over the banner. John Jay had acquired an option to purchase the banner, and he had had other people put in the money to buy it, and then there was an agreement under which they were supposed to buy him out, and they didn't, and that turned into a very contentious piece of litigation. That's where I met John Jay and ended up having an extended relationship with him throughout our careers.
So he had put in an option to purchase the Nashville Banner newspaper back when we had two dailies, the Tennessean and the Nashville Banner. And
Yep.
he wanted to buy one of them.
Yes, he had the rights to buy it, but he didn't have the money to buy it, which was somewhat typical of John Jay.
During this time, when you were practicing at Dearborn and Ewing, did you see a change in the practice of law from when you first got out of law school in '76?
Yes, you were beginning to see more women in practice. And also, shortly after I joined Dearborn and Ewing, two or 3 years after, Cyrus Booker was hired by the firm who became the first African-American lawyer hired by a larger firm in Nashville.
What year was that?
83, maybe?
Okay. Why did you leave Dearborn and Ewing?
I got appointed to be a judge by Governor Alexander.
And you were how old?
I was 34 years old.
Did you just wake up one day and say, you know what, I think it's time for me to be
Well,
a judge?
it kind of seemed that way because it didn't really make a lot of sense. I had said various times well before that someday I'd like to be a judge. And Luke Connor had heard me make that statement, and here in 1986, 85 or 86, whatever it was, one of the circuit court judges had announced that he was going to retire.
That's Judge Joe Lozer?
Joe Lozer. And Lou called me and said, "Are you still interested in becoming a judge?" I said, "Yeah, someday I'd like to be a judge." He said, "Well, are you interested in becoming a judge now?" I said, I really hadn't thought about it. I said, "Is there really a chance?" And he said, "I don't know if there's a chance, but I can, help put your name in." And so I talked to Judy, and Judy had made very clear to me in the prior year or so that I was not being a particularly good father or husband because I was working too hard and I was traveling too much and I wasn't being terribly responsible. And if this came true, not only would it be a great opportunity for me, but it would give me a much more regular schedule and I could become much more reliable. So I talked to Lou, and having zero sense that this could actually ever happen at that time, and said, "Sure." And then waited and waited. Never had any contact from the governor's office, was never interviewed. There was no formal process at that time for selection. There was no screening commission, nothing like that. And then I heard that people who were interested were going to talk to Judge Lozer. So I figured I better go talk to Judge Lozer. And Judge Lozer was rather cantankerous judge by reputation, and I had been treated that same way by him as everybody else had. And I went over to see him, and we're talking. And I asked him if it was a very cordial conversation. I asked him if he had any advice for a young lawyer should he become a judge. He said no. He did tell me, though, that I was his choice to succeed him, which shocked me because I had no reason to think that. But he did say that although he didn't have any advice, he had one request, and he said that if I did become the judge, and if he then appeared before me, if I would agree to treat him respectfully. And without trying to be smart or anything, I said to him, well, Judge, I would expect to treat you at least as well as you've treated me every time I've come over here. And he laughed, and he said, well, really, I was hoping for something a little better. And then I got appointed. And again, I never talked to the governor. My parents were in town.
So how did you know you were appointed? Did Lou call you?
I think I got a call. I don't remember if I got a call from Lou. There was a call from the governor, and I may have got, no, I didn't know about it before then. I got a call from the governor, but it was kind of funny because there was a call at home, and this would be about the time that I would be calling to give my lame excuse for why I was going to be late. And when Judy would answer the phone, she'd have kind of an edge in her voice to make sure I understood that I wasn't complying with the rules. And so she answers the phone and says, hello, is Matt Sweeney there? No, he's still at the office. And the caller says, well, this is Governor Lamar Alexander. And Judy says, if you'd hold for just a moment, I'll get Mrs. Sweeney. And then she puts the phone down. And then she gets back.
That's quick.
And then she picks the phone back up again and says, oh, hello, Governor. Oh, it's so good to talk. Oh, no, he's not. I'm sure you can get him at the office. So then he calls over to the office, and I'm not taking any calls because I figured it was Judy who was trying to find me. And I get paged, and I asked the operator if she could check and see who it is, and she says, well, he says he's Lamar Alexander. And so I took that call, and that's how I knew.
So what did you do to prepare to go to the bench as a young lawyer? You're still, what, only 33, 34?
I was 34 years old. I read. I went and observed. I kind of went back to old trial notebooks that I had to kind of, review kind of process and timelines and things like that. One of the funniest parts is I went around to visit most of the judges in the courthouse, some who I knew and some who I didn't. This is before I started, just to introduce myself. And I went to see Randall Wyatt, and he was trying a case. And so I was sitting there in the back watching for a while, and then they took a break, and I got brought back into his chambers and introduced to him. He said, oh, well, it's, he didn't know me either. And he said, well, it's good to meet you and know who you are because I couldn't match you up with any of the jurors.
Did you understand?
And I said, I'm sorry, Judge, I don't understand. He said, well, you don't do a lot of criminal practice, do you? I said, no, I didn't do that much. He said, well, this is a sequestered jury. And I still had no clue. And he said, oh, well, when we have sequestered juries here, it's not unusual for spouses to come up here and see if their husband or wife is really on jury duty as they said they were. And he said, so I looked at you and I looked at the jurors and I couldn't match you up with anyone, so I couldn't figure out who you were.
Did you meet with anyone else? You met with all the judges at the time?
I don't remember if I met with everyone. I met with most everyone. I remember meeting with Judge Harry Lester, and I had tried a few cases in front of him. And at the end of our conversation, he said, have you tried any cases over here before? I said, yeah, Judge, I've tried a couple. He said, couldn't be anything significant. I don't remember you at all.
That's comforting. So what was it like being a young trial judge? Were you well received by the older members of the bar?
I felt that I was very well received by the older members of the bar generally. I felt that I was very well experienced. I felt very comfortable on the bench. As a matter of fact, to this day, I still think that I was probably better suited to be a judge than ever to be a lawyer. I really, really enjoyed being a judge. There were very, very few things that I encountered, at least on the civil side, that I hadn't encountered before. There certainly were some challenging times. I was trying to think of her name the other day. There was this East Nashville slumlord, Carrie something. Anyway, for years and years and years, she had been ordered in General Sessions Court, I later learned, to repair properties of hers, and she never did. And then when I'm a judge, there's a case that comes up from General Sessions, and it's appealed up. And eventually I order her to make certain repairs and all like that to the properties, and she didn't. And I held her in contempt. Well, the question is, what is kind of the right, how do you handle that with someone who is like 85 years old? And I decided that I was going to put her in jail. But I also wanted to make sure that she was okay while she was there. So I sentenced her to serve her time in the lockup at the Metro General Hospital.
How much time?
5 days or something like that. And she then ended up selling all her property.
Selling all of it?
She was finally in compliance.
What other cases stand out to you that you presided over during that period?
There was a case of a crusty old lawyer who was used to having his way in court, and there was a interesting evidentiary issue that came up, and I determined that you had to meet certain predicates before you could put on evidence regarding the recall of vehicles. And in the middle of the case, we had a jury out hearing to see whether the predicate had been met, and I determined that it hadn't. And so I ruled that there would be no reference to recalls. And the next witness that lawyer put on, the first question they asked him was about recalls. I granted a mistrial. I decided there was no way to unring that bell. And then opposing counsel asked for me to impose attorney's fees. So I had them brief it and argue it, and I determined that that was an appropriate sanction, and I did that. And the lawyer was very annoyed with me, and it probably resulted, I guess, in the best quote about me, where he told the press that I was smart but dangerous. He also said that if a judge could do to him what I did, that he could summarily execute him in the courtroom, which I had not seriously considered.
Did he come before you after that case?
I don't think that he did.
So after your time on the bench, and so what is that, 92 that you left the bench?
1990, when I left the bench.
Why leave? You said it was your best job.
Well, I talked about that one quote about smart but dangerous. I figure that one of two things is going to be the epitaph on my grave, either smart but dangerous, or he left the bench because he wasn't getting paid enough, which is what people said when I decided not to seek re-election. At that point, we had a son who was just about ready to begin college. The famous Professor Judy Sweeney was afraid that she was about to lose her job at Vanderbilt because they were doing a restructuring, and she was the last person who didn't have a doctorate. And so it looked like all of a sudden Judy was going to lose her job. That meant that we were going to lose the scholarship at Vanderbilt, and we had a son who was going to begin college. So Judy and I talked about it, and we decided that it made most sense for me to go back into private practice. So that's what I did, with the hope that maybe someday I'd have another chance of being a judge, but of course that never worked out.
Did you try to be a judge again?
Yes.
On how many occasions?
3, 4, something like that. But the moon and the stars have to be perfectly aligned, and they never were. And you had asked some about politics. I was a Democrat who was appointed by a Republican who was elected as a Democrat, which gave both sides pause from time to time.
So after you left the bench as a judge and you went back into private practice, did you go back to Dearborn and Ewing?
No, Dearborn and Ewing at that point was kind of, I don't know exactly what the right word is. Eventually it merged with Bolt. And so at that point there were issues because of changes in the tax law and banks that had been sold off where there were various issues. So I ended up going to Ferris Warfield.
And this is 90?
90.
In 1990?
1990. And then 4 years later, a group of us split off from there to form Tukeyop and Sweeney. And then I guess it's 6 years after that, after pretty much doubling in size from, 14 or 15 to 27 or 28, we merged with Dinsmore and Scholl out of Cincinnati.
And that was in 2000.
Another great firm. And then 4 years after that, we closed down that office, and most of us came over to Baker Donaldson.
And that was in 2004.
2004.
Where you've been practicing ever since.
Ever since.
Talk about some of the major cases that you've been involved with. For example, the prison riot cases. Who presided over those cases?
Judge Wiseman was the judge in the prison riot case. And there are a couple memorable things from that. That case eventually got settled, so it never went to trial. But we did have these 2 long case management trials or pretrial conferences just as we were moving toward trial. And one of them, I brought in this kind of big paint bucket full of weapons that had been confiscated out at the prison in the couple months before the riots. And, I don't know how many, there were probably 50, 60 or more shivs and various other weapons and a battle axe in there that I told Judge Wiseman we wanted to introduce into evidence to show the reasonable apprehension that the officers had of what they would face as they retook the prison. Judge Wiseman was not at all inclined to allow the introduction of the bucket of weapons. He was particularly concerned about the battle axe, which somebody had taken kind of a tool handle, a long tool handle, and had welded to it a curved, sharp piece of steel so that it was literally like a battle axe. And when the case got settled, we presented it to Judge Wiseman, and for years it sat on the credenza in his chambers. I don't know whatever happened to it. So that was an interesting case. That's also one where in these 2 pretrial conferences, one of them we were eventually back in his office discussing things, and this was a time when an awful lot of people still smoked, and we had all run out of cigarettes. And we were literally smoking cigarette butts out of the ashtray in his office using paper clips to hold them like roach clips. We were a little desperate for nicotine at that point.
It was during that case that I guess one of your children were...
No, that was later. That was another, probably the most interesting case that I ever had, which was the temple bombing case. And that was where an alleged group of members of the Klan and of the Nazis were accused of conspiring to blow up the temple out on Harding Road.
The Jewish temple.
The Jewish temple on Harding Road.
This is 1981, 82?
Something like that. And it was, yes, it was 1980, it was 81 and 82. And so it was the most interesting case that I ever had. We did individual jury selection, one at a time, one potential juror in the room at the time, because of all the explosive issues that were attached to the case. This was a case where the judge had to tell the jurors, potential jurors, that being a member of the KKK was not illegal. We also spent a lot of time asking older jurors about their attitude towards Nazis and service in World War II. We had pretrial seizure of a TV show, which was an interview with the undercover officer, pre-broadcast, because it was going to be broadcast in the middle of the trial, which of course you could never do now. It was a situation where the brother of the undercover officer called me up in the middle of the trial and wanted to talk to me and only me, and late at night up on Gallatin Road. And I was young and dumb and went up there for the interview. And the only smart thing I did was I put my little pocket recorder in and turned it on. He frisked me. He didn't find it. And then in the conversation, he offered to testify against his brother if we paid him.
And his brother was an undercover.
And we turned that all over to Judge Wiseman the next morning. But anyway, eventually everybody got convicted. Everybody went to jail except for the client that Charlie Ray and I represented. Charlie had been appointed early to represent this fellow.
And you all are representing the Ku Klux Klan's members.
We were representing an alleged Nazi.
An alleged Nazi accused of bombing.
Conspiring to bomb.
Conspiring to bomb
Yes.
the Jewish temple.
Yes. And Charlie wasn't getting along all that well with our client. So Judge Wiseman appointed me thinking that maybe I'd get along better with this guy than Charlie would. Eventually, Charlie's a great lawyer, and I learned a lot to be able to co-represent this defendant with Charlie. But at the end of the case, Charlie was permitted to withdraw, so then it was time for sentencing. I was representing this guy alone. And we were expecting a baby, and Judge Wiseman knew that. And the night before sentencing, I'm at the office, I'm doing my final prep, and Judy calls me up and says, "It's time, come get me, gotta go." And so I called up Judge Wiseman and said that I wasn't going to be able to make it to sentencing in the morning.
You called the judge, where was he?
At home. And I told him, and he said, "Okay, well, if everything's okay, just call me and we'll do the sentencing in the afternoon." I said, "Judge, I don't think that's going to work." And he said, "Oh yeah, it's been a long time. Well, call me next week and we'll get a new time." And so we did. And I proposed that this defendant, who had basically withdrawn from the alleged conspiracy, have his sentence suspended, and that he could do public service work for the National Conference of Christians and Jews.
The National Conference of Christians and Jews.
Right. And Judge Wiseman basically told me I was crazy. He said, besides that, they'll never accept him. And I said, "Well, Judge, they will accept him, and I've got the executive director here." And he basically said that they were crazy. But he went along with it, and my client did his public service work over there and completed what he had to do.
What was the hardest case you ever had?
Hardest case I ever had was a few years ago when I got appointed to represent a guy in a post-conviction death penalty case.
Tell me about the case.
Young guy, alleged gang-related killings of a couple other guys who were selling guns. Tried here in Davidson County, sentenced to death, which was unusual in Davidson County. It was a case where there were all sorts of issues. 3 of us here at the office agreed to take it on together, and I took the lead responsibility for it. I had never dealt with a death penalty case before.
Why did you take it?
I took it because there were a need for attorneys to do it, and there had been a request by Judge Merritt and Judge Daughtry that
On the Sixth Circuit?
On the Sixth Circuit, that firms take on these types of cases. And so the firm agreed to take one on, and so I took it. And there are all sorts of problems in the case as far as how it was done and what wasn't done. And I mean, one of the big issues regarding sentencing in a death penalty case has to do with evidence that you can present to the jury to show why this person should not be killed. And frequently there's a psychologist that gets used to collect information and then to present information to explain it. And when we're talking to the defense attorney about why he didn't present psychological information at the trial, he said basically, well, you know, I kind of considered psychology to be like trigonometry in high school. I never understood that either.
Oh, Lord.
So he never presented any psychological evidence. And that was one of the multiple issues of very serious problems that, in my mind, the courts do not consider in a way that they should. There were so many basic problems in this criminal case, which, if it was on the civil side, would have been malpractice, which on the criminal side just kind of get, in my view, given a pass, which is extraordinarily concerning to me. We did get the death penalty set aside. There was an aggravator that was based on perjured evidence that we were able to show, and so the trial court, the original sentencing court, recognized that that was improper, and that court set it aside, and the Court of Criminal Appeals sustained that. So we saved his life, but it's still discomforting at this point.
You once said it was the most emotionally wrenching case you had ever had. Why is that?
Because you're dealing with life and death, and you're dealing with somebody very young, and you're dealing with somebody that when you look at it, you say, there had to be a better way.
When you took the case, did you believe that the state should have a death penalty?
When I took on the case, I wasn't thinking about that one way or the other. I've had various views about the death penalty over time. I've been totally opposed, I've been totally supportive, and I've had various middle grounds. I don't know, in my view, I don't know that the death penalty can be done properly, certainly not the way that we're structured now. If it could be, then yes, I think it could be appropriate in certain circumstances. But you'd have to approach death penalty cases entirely differently and put resources on the front end rather than the back end.
Couple more questions. Who was your favorite judge to appear before, or in period, or any circumstance, and why?
I always enjoyed appearing in front of Judge Wiseman. He was just a great judge. He let you try your case, yet he controlled the proceedings. He was somebody who was open to being persuaded. And I always enjoyed appearing in front of him. He's probably my number one.
As you look back over this life as a lawyer, you know, well, before I ask you that, what is it that you've done with respect to providing service to the bar over the last, I guess, 10 years, 15 years?
Well, I guess from around the time when I became a judge, maybe a little bit before that, I began to become active in the bar. Originally, it was the state bar, brought in by Evans Harville, who I can't remember if at that point he was the president of the bar or former president of the bar. He's from Clarksville. He was the first one who brought me into the bar committees and working on drafting rules. And then I got involved in the Nashville Bar Association, particularly in the area of professional ethics and responsibility. In recent times, I became active in the American Inns of Court, locally here and eventually on the national board. And I'm on the board of the National Judicial College, and I'm now the former chair of that board. And the National Judicial College, which is located in Reno, Nevada, is the primary institution to educate state judges throughout the United States. Great institution. I attended when I was a trial court judge, and it's been my great privilege to serve on the board for the last, whatever it's been, 8 years or so.
What's the nature of your practice today?
Mediations and arbitrations. I don't take any clients anymore, so I'm just serving as an ADR neutral. Basically in business and employment cases.
What is retirement, whatever that means to you? What does that look like to you?
I've been trying to figure that out. I don't know. My father retired too early.
How old was he?
62. And my mom found one day that he had gone to the dump to find a third label to send it in for a 25-cent refund. at which time she decided she needed to find something to keep the boy busy. So I don't want to fall into that. So, you know, I have things that I want to do. I do want to go back to school and take a poetry course or two and see if I can rev that back up again. I don't know if that's possible. I'd like to learn to become a good photographer and do it on some of my adventure hiking. I like to hike a lot and do some of it with our youngest son. So I'd like to do more of that. And the kids gave me a banjo that I'd like to learn how to play, which I have no idea how to, but I hope maybe someday to figure out how to do that.
So looking back on your fantastic career, any thoughts for a new lawyer starting out in 2018?
Yeah, don't be a plumber.
What do you mean?
I mean, don't just think about the mechanics of what you're doing and how the pieces fit together. Look at it more broadly. Lawyers have a social responsibility to protect and promote the Constitution. Be curious, be skeptical, be protective, and work hard.
Thanks, Matt.
Glad to.